Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. The last episode, the King and Queen went to Canada to see their people and to strengthen the bond between Canada and England. President Roosevelt asked them to go to the United States, too. The English government thought that might be a good idea in order to have the United States support should England go to war. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth covered a lot of territory in Canada, and they saw the love and support of the people. So let's see how they did in the United States. In the United States, memories of the First World War was still fresh. In 1935, Congress had passed the Neutrality Act aimed at keeping the United States out of any European war. President Roosevelt attempted to modify the act to allow the supply of munitions to Britain and France, but met with fierce opposition in the Senate. The King and Queen didn't expect an exuberant welcome from an American public that was still dazzled by memories of a popular and glamorous ex-king who gave up the throne for an American woman. American newspapers weren't into them at first. In Scribner's magazine, an article by Josel Israelis II insisted that a large part of the USA believed that Edward VIII should still be king and that George VI was a colorless, weak personality. As for the Queen, she was far too plump of figure, too dowdy in dress, to meet American specifications of a reigning queen. Well, that wasn't very nice. So on the train to the United States, it stopped at Baltimore before arriving at Washington, and the King and Queen got off briefly. According to Joseph Kennedy's diary dated July 21st, 1939, the Queen told him that a woman looking exactly like the Duchess of Windsor came up to her with a bouquet. The Queen said, "I don't know what to think. I knew she came from Baltimore, and after that I realized it couldn't be she. I thought it must be her sister. Anyhow, I had a few uncomfortable minutes." At 11 a.m. on June the 8th, the King and Queen arrived at Washington's Union Station in the most stupendous heat, as the Queen recorded. The formal clothes didn't help. The King was wearing his full dress uniform and the Admiral of the Fleet. The Queen was looking cool, according to the press, but she didn't feel that way. She had on a full-length pearl gray dress and jacket with deep cuffs of fur, gloves, and a hat. Queen Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary, "I really don't know how we got through those 2 days of continuous functions, mostly out of doors, as it really was ghastly. It was very damp heat, and one could hardly breathe," she wrote to Queen Mary. President and Mrs. Roosevelt greeted them at the station. The King and President exchanged formal greetings and a historic handshake. The Capitol outdid itself to make welcome the first reigning British King and Queen ever to set foot on American soil. Eleanor Roosevelt, who wrote a regular newspaper column called My Day, observed the Queen's way of reacting to crowds as they drove together to the White House. She had the most gracious manner and bowed right and left with interest, actually looking at the people in the crowd, so that I'm sure many of them felt that her bow was for them personally. Once they got to the White House, the King and Queen met with the chiefs of mission of Washington's diplomatic corps before at last they could change into lighter clothes and sit down to an informal lunch with the Roosevelts, their 3 sons, and their wives. Also along was Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. After lunch, they had a sightseeing drive around Washington. The humidity was horrible. According to Joseph Kennedy, the Queen told him that afterwards she lay on the floor in a room in the White House, the hottest place she had ever been to, despite the newly installed air conditioners, to recover. That evening they had to go to a state dinner and a reception. The Queen wore a crinoline of white tulle sprinkled with gold palettes, and she sat between the President and Vice President Gardner for dinner. According to the diary of Harold Ickes, who was the American Secretary of the Interior, he commented on the behavior of the Vice President, who he felt had no breeding because he put his arm around the King as if he were a poker crony. He also said that the King and Queen looked like pygmies beside the Roosevelts. The heat was relentless, with Harold Ickes' wife saying that the men's shirts buckled in the middle and their collars wilted. Women, including the unfortunate Queen, turned beet-like. At the end of the dinner, the President made a short speech emphasizing the harmonious relations between the USA and Britain, and the King replied in kind. Next, there was a concert where 200 more guests arrived, and there they heard Negro spirituals, cowboy ballads, folk songs sung by the Coon Creek Girls of Pincham, Tide Hollow in Kentucky, folk dances by Soco Gap Square Dance Team, and a finale of art music songs by American and European composers, sung by Kate Smith, and the Metropolitan Opera's baritone Lawrence Tibbett and Marian Anderson, the black contralto. Mrs. Roosevelt admired her fine voice. The next day, the king and queen were surprised that the day was even hotter, 97 degrees in the shade, and more strenuous. They lunched with the Roosevelts in the presidential yacht, the USS Potomac, sailing to Mount Vernon, the home of George Washington. The king placed a wreath on George Washington's tomb, and the queen was presented with a bouquet by the Mount Vernon gardener. Afterwards, they drove with the Roosevelts to Fort Hunt, Virginia, to visit the Civilian Conservation Corps camp. It was a New Deal project for unemployed youth. The king and queen had asked to see this, and they impressed Eleanor Roosevelt by talking to each boy. From there, they drove by to Arlington Cemetery, where the king laid wreaths, and they had an informal tea at the White House. Following that, an informal but not relaxing for some 16 heads of government agencies concerned with social and economic programs assembled to meet them. The long, hot day ended with a dinner given by the king and queen for the Roosevelts at the British Embassy. Then they left to rejoin their train at Union Station. They waved goodbye on the rear platform of their train. The Queen seemed to steal the show in Washington. 3 cheers for the Queen was one verdict. Give the Queen a crowd and she mows them down was another. It was also noted that the Queen had a pleasant way of remaining in the background until times that her presence is required, and she smiled affectionately at her husband when he spoke, and he returned the attention with a swifter, shyer glance. The train took them overnight to Sandy Hook, New Jersey, where they got on the American destroyer USS Warrington to sail to the Battery in New York City. It was a trying day. They had unscheduled presentations. The mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, and the president of the World's Fair, Grover Whalen, caused it to be out of control. The king and queen were greeted by the governor of New York, Herbert Lehman, and Mayor LaGuardia, and driven through Manhattan to the World's Fair in Queens. Their open car, showered with ticker tape, cheered by enormous crowds of between 3 and 4 million. A New York newspaper thought it was good for the king to wear an ordinary English gentleman's outfit rather than a showy uniform, but they commented he looked very tired and waved mechanically. The queen, who wore a plain blue crepe dress and cape and a spectacular hat with an ostrich feather plume, giving her extra height, was less visibly tired, and she waved to the crowd. The drive with the mayor took 40 minutes longer than scheduled. Then Whalen insisted on presenting some 500 extra people to them. They shook 200 hands and got a fascist salute from the Italian commissioner, and then by then that was at the fair, so then the king had had enough. So they were behind schedule for their next engagement, a brief visit to Columbia University, chosen because it had been founded by the royal charter in the reign of King George II. When they got to their final destination, President Roosevelt's country home at Hyde Park in Dutchess County, it was an 80-mile drive, and they were an hour and a half late. They were greeted by the president, his wife, and his mother, Sarah Roosevelt, a matriarch who had little in common with her daughter-in-law, Eleanor. The king and queen spent a night and day at home with the Roosevelts, and it was enjoyable for both of them. It was a comfortable house on the banks of the Hudson, and the king and queen loved it. The queen wrote that at moments one really feels like one is at home in England, she said to Queen Mary. After dinner, the king, the president, and Mackenzie King discussed the danger of war. The king and Roosevelt had a rapport. The king said that Roosevelt is so easy to get to know and never makes one feel shy. The talks between them, and the king took detailed notes, showed that Roosevelt was anxious to cooperate with Britain and Canada in naval defense of the Atlantic. Roosevelt was working on American public opinion in the case of war in Europe and to amend the Neutrality Act to make it less difficult for the USA to help Britain. Mackenzie King recorded the conversation that Roosevelt proposed helping Canada set up aircraft manufacturing plants. The next day was Sunday, and the king and queen went with the Roosevelts to the Episcopal Church at St. James in Hyde Park Village. The queen felt at home. The service was exactly the same as ours down to the word, and she said to Queen Mary in a letter, and they even had the prayers for the king and the royal family. I could not help thinking how curious it sounded, and yet how natural. Afterwards, the queen had fun talking to her daughters on the transatlantic telephone before she and the king were driven by President Roosevelt up to the cottage he had recently built on Hyde Park Estate. The Queen said it was a frightening experience because the president's legs were paralyzed by polio and the car was adopted to be driven with hands alone. Roosevelt drove at high speeds, talking, pointing out sights, and waving his cigarette holder about, as well as operating the controls. The Queen felt that there were times I thought we could go right off the road and tumble down the hills. Then they had a picnic lunch, and the Queen wrote to her daughters, "We all sat at little tables under the trees round the house and had all our food on one plate. A little salmon, some turkey, some ham, lettuce, beans, and," she put in caps, "hot dogs, too." Then they moved on to Eleanor Roosevelt's own little cottage, where the King and the President and his sons bathed in the swimming pool, while the Queen sat in the shade and watched. So I don't know where Eleanor was, but she wasn't mentioned. Then the Queen told her daughter Elizabeth it was the first really quiet moment they'd had in weeks. The royal train headed from New Jersey to Hyde Park Station, and the King and Queen said goodbye to the Roosevelts. The train pulled out of the station with the song "Auld Lang Syne" being sung by assembled spectators. It was an emotional moment for everyone. Eleanor said the threat of tragedy in Europe weighed on everyone there, and the song brought out feelings of friendship, sadness, and uncertainty for the future. The Queen's contribution was substantial. One observer gave her credit for the change in the way Americans saw Britain. He said, in admiration of this one woman, America has somehow blinded herself to Chamberlain, has forgotten Munich, and now sees only the strong British nation again. Eleanor had a slightly critical comment about the Queen. She said she liked her and thought her perfect as Queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing, and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. But she then said, who would be self-conscious in the Queen's place? She later said she was fascinated by the Queen, who never had a crease in her dress or a hair out of place. I do not see how it's possible to remain so perfectly in character all the time. She was different than Eleanor personality-wise, and Eleanor approved of the Queen's interest in social problems and her thoughtfulness in small things, like thanking her chauffeur for his careful driving. The Queen was touched by the kindness the Roosevelts had shown her and the King. She thought they were charming and a united family and praised their easy, polished manners. The President thought the Queen was delightful and very good company. The King felt that he had never met anyone with whom he could talk so freely with than Roosevelt. He felt as though Roosevelt was a father, giving him his most careful and wise advice. The royal train then headed back to Canada, and they started to do their Canadian tour again with visits to New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. If the King was busy with correspondence or state affairs, the Queen would descend to the platform alone, and the crowds would thrill at her smile and the wave of her hand. So I'm going to end the video here. The King and Queen have certainly been busy on the last few videos, traveling throughout Canada, then crossing into the United States. The Roosevelts were great hosts, and the King and Queen felt comfortable in their company. The King, and especially the Queen, had the crowd under their spell. It left many in America thinking more of the British nation than of Europe, and that had to help the King and Queen. It must have been amazing to see Queen Elizabeth in person. It sounds like she left everyone starstruck. She had charm and a smile that one never forgot. President Roosevelt made promises to the King, but he couldn't guarantee the assistance he was making until he went to Congress with it. But at least the wheels got in motion, and possibly Britain would have an ally with the United States. It's been interesting to see them touring in different countries and finding the same large crowds that they had seen at home. That must have made them feel great, especially since King Edward VIII had been to Canada and he had popularity there while he was the king. In the next video, we find the King and Queen making their last rounds in Canada, and then they get back home, which should be exciting to learn more about. I hope everybody enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would really help out the channel. I hope everybody's been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.